What's up, y'all? This is Uncle Jack 328. Follow me on Twitter at Uncle Jack 328. Let's talk some boxing here real quick, y'all. We are less than 24 hours away from Jermell Charlo versus Brian Castano for the Undisputed Junior Middleweight Championship of the world. In my opinion, the best weight class in the sport of boxing. When we think about level of competition, quality of fights, upsets, knockouts, all of these things contribute to this moment and this fight that we are getting tomorrow night. Going back to fights like Jarrett Hurd versus Erislandy Lara, Jermell Charlo versus Tony Harrison, Jarrett Hurd versus Julian Williams, Julian Williams versus Jason Rosario, Jason Rosario versus Jermell Charlo, Erislandy Lara versus Brian Castano, Brian Castano versus Patrick Teixeira. All of these fights have been waged on a very high skill level, high stakes, and very competitive fights. Cannot be understated how we got to this point here and the quality of matchups that we got leading up to this fight. But digress. Talking about Brian Castano for a minute here, WBO junior middleweight champion from Argentina. Over the last decade, I think the perception that we have gotten from fighters coming from Argentina are rugged brawlers, power punchers, guys who are imposing their physicality. Two of those guys that come to mind are Lucas Matisse and Marcos Maidana in terms of top level. We also had Sergio Martinez, but he was a little bit different. He was more of a southpaw mover, hard punching, in and out athletic type fighter. But the general perception is that fighters from Argentina are here to do one thing. They're here to inflict damage in a rude, rugged, kind of, I guess, unskillful way, which may or may not have been a fair perception. With Brian Castano, you see a fighter who is probably more technically skilled in terms of application of a skill set than Lucas Matisse and Marcos Maidana. In the two fights that I've seen that kind of got him that notoriety here in the United States, against Erislandy Lara and against Patrick Teixeira, I seen a fighter who at 5'7.5" or 5'8", relatively short for 154 pounds, I seen a fighter who knows what he's doing and is also 100% sure in how to impose his style. Against Lara, who is an excellent boxer, I seen footwork. I seen footwork, combination punching, head movement. I seen all of these things that he used in order to be able to arguably win that fight, but pull out a draw. And I seen against Patrick Teixeira, who is a fighter that's about 6 foot, 6'1", 6'2", I seen him constantly use that footwork to stay in position to be able to really beat him up, to really kind of put a beating on him en route to a decision victory. The thing that sticks out to me the most with Brian Castano is the footwork. Most fighters who get that reputation as being pressure fighters tend to kind of walk you down a little bit. There aren't too many come forward aggressive fighters that cut angles or cut down the ring, as they say. And with Brian Castano, the thing that I noticed that jumped out to me specifically in the fight with Erislandy Lara was, instead of walking you down, instead of coming to his fighter in a way that's kind of the same, that's kind of methodical, I seen him cutting off the ring, kind of shuffling forward, sliding, moving over to the right, to the left, underneath, taking a half step back. All of these things in order to get in position and stay in position to be able to land combinations. Now, just because a fighter is pressing the action or cutting off the ring, that doesn't mean that they're not boxing. That doesn't mean that in terms of ring generalship, clean punching, defense, all of these things that judges are supposed to be looking for when scoring rounds, it doesn't mean that he's not doing that. The way that he goes about doing that is what's impressive to me. There were moments in the fight against Erislandy Lara where you could argue that he was outboxing a guy who prior to that had the reputation as the best boxer in that weight class. As I mentioned earlier, against Patrick Teixeira, that same footwork, that same shuffling and sliding, and those same angles that he was using allowed him to get underneath some of those punches and completely negate that whole height and reach advantage. In this fight, those skills that I mentioned could find him some success against Jermell Charlo, depending on how much return fire he's able to take. Now, Jermell Charlo, WBC, WBA, IBF Ring Magazine champion. A fighter who, in my opinion, is already worthy of that pound-for-pound recognition. Earlier in his career, he had the reputation as being a stick-and-move fighter, a boxer, a guy who was there to score points behind an excellent jab, give you a little bit of lateral movement, and win his fights kind of in the same fashion. Earlier in his career, against guys like Vanis Martirosyan and Gabriel Rosado, you've seen some of that, but that could also be attributed to the level of competition. Jermell Charlo, going back to before he won his first championship up to now, has consistently, in my opinion, been fighting at a high level of competition, which could contribute to why in some of these fights he doesn't look overly impressive up until the moment he scores the knockout. But the progression in Jermell Charlo from being a stick and move kind of lateral movement, heavy jab, heavy in and out bouncing kind of fighter to a guy who's knocked out just about every opponent since he's been a champion. Erickson Lubin, Tony Harrison in the rematch, Jason Rosario, John Jackson in the fight that won him the championship, Jorge Cota in a tune-up fight for the rematch against Tony Harrison. It has to be appreciated when a guy in these high-level fights is ending them in a way that leaves no doubt. Jermell Charlo, at this point in his career, has to be recognized as one of the best punchers in boxing. Even if his knockout percentage doesn't reflect it, when you look at the fights that he's been in, you look at how hard he's punching against some of these guys who are clearly quality fighters based on what they've done after fighting him, you got to give it up to him. You got to give him that credit. With Jermell Charlo, and I hope I'm not reaching with this comparison that I want to make, because I can see where people might take this the wrong way. In my opinion, Jermell Charlo is a less explosive but more durable Terry Norris. Terry Norris was a very fast twitch, very fluid, very quick on his reaction, kind of aggressive boxer puncher, while Jermell Charlo is similar in that he kind of is up on his toes a little bit, bouncing in and out. He might not be as fluid or maybe even as technically solid as Terry Norris, but he is more durable than Terry Norris, and the mean streak in the application of what it is that he knows how to do is what kind of reminds me of that when making that comparison. But back to this fight here. In this fight here, I think that it could look similar to some of Jermell Charlo's other fights at the top level. And that, what I mean is, Jermell Charlo is going to lose rounds in just about every fight that he's in at this top level. That's not a negative reflection on him and what he's capable of in the ring. That's more of a reflection of the diversity in the styles and, and the quality of the opponents that he's facing in each of these fights. If there were to be a skills competition, a boxing skills measurement competition of who throws the jab with the best technique, who gets from one spot to the ring to the other spot of the ring the quickest, who does what with the best amount of technique, Brian Castano probably has the edge based on that extensive amateur career and just what you're seeing when you see the two of them fight each other. If this is a competition of who's going to look better early, I think Brian Castano could have the early edge while this fight is still a boxing match. Because, as I said before, Jermell Charlo lost rounds against Tony Harrison. He lost rounds against Jason Rosario, even though he knocked him out and got multiple knockdowns in that fight. John Jackson was ahead on points before that knockout as well. But what separates Jermell Charlo at this point in his career from all the other fighters that he's shared the ring with is obviously the conditioning has been A1 up until this point. The other part of it has to be the ability to take the punch. It has to be the durability. It has to be the fact that he tends to take the punches better than his opponent. It's hard to pick against him at this point in time, even knowing that he's going to lose rounds in this fight. With with Brian Castano, the important thing is if he's able to win rounds, if he's in a position to where after 5 or 6 rounds, he's up 4 rounds to 2 or possibly 5 rounds to 1. Will he be able to continue to hold up that same level of consistency as he presses forward? That same level of technique is what we'll say here. Or is it going to be a case where Jermell Charlo eventually catches up to him due to that conditioning and that durability? Once we get to the rounds 7, 8, and 9, that's when we will know if this is still a boxing match or if this is a fight. If this becomes the kind of fight where punches that are being exchanged are meant to do damage, it's hard not to favor Jermell Charlo in that kind of fight. Because up to this point, even at the top level, if he's able to hurt his opponents, they're going home. I will say this. We have seen Jermell Charlo get a little bit frustrated in some of his fights, specifically that first fight against Tony Harrison, where it looked like he was intentionally trying to punch too hard. When Tony Harrison was jabbing and kind of not complying and letting him do some of the things he wanted to do, the frustration was visible. Even if that fight was close and there's an argument for him winning that fight, the frustration was there and the kind of wildness was there, and it showed in a way that hadn't showed before. He shored some of these things up in his next couple fights, but that's also something to kind of keep track of as well as these rounds progress. Again, not making a prediction, but the most likely outcomes to this fight. The late rounds of this fight, if we make it there, should be highly competitive and possibly dramatic, depending on what position each one of these fighters are in. I don't know for sure if Brian Castano will be durable enough to hold off the late round charge of Jermell Charlo. I know that the early rounds of this fight might look like they are going in favor of Brian Castano, but Jermell Charlo has proven to have that stand power. And as these rounds progress, if the punch output is up from Jermell Charlo, I see him possibly pulling out this fight by a close decision, or possibly a draw-ish type 7-5, 6-6, 8-4 type of fight, either way. But I think we're in for a good fight, and it's possible, depending on the outcome, that we might see this again. And Brian Castano has an excellent chance at winning this fight if he's able to take what Jermell Charlo is bringing. So that's what we got. I will be doing a post-fight review tomorrow night as well. This is my first video in about 7 months. This is Uncle Jack 328. Please like, share, and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at Uncle Jack 328. I'll see y'all at the fight. We out of here.